Hello, my name is John McCall, and welcome to this session, Getting the Most Out of the SAS Macro Language in SQL. So we will take a look at some SQL syntax along with some macro programming syntax, combining the two to generate some results. So let's get started. I want to first give you an idea of what we will cover. The first will be a simple listing with PROC SQL. I will show you how to generate a listing for specific columns and embed a title. By default, you get a report with PROC SQL. Secondly, we will use a macro program in SQL code to generate a statistic and assign it to a macro variable. And that macro variable will display in the title, a second title along with the first title, displaying the columns. The third program will be to generate a list of distinct or unique values. And one of the things you can do is put it in a footnote. So let's say that I want a report on a particular car make, such as Chevrolet, and I show a particular car type, and I can look at the particular models, the types, and the MSRP. But in the footnote, we have the vehicle types associated with the make. Now, it might be, instead of displaying the distinct list in your footnote, perhaps you want to do some validation. So let's say you write a macro program, and embedded in it is some code that generates some statistics, and you give it to me, and you say, well, you're welcome to use this macro program. All I have to do is supply a make, like Audi or Chevrolet. But let's say I mistype it. Well, let's say that you've accounted for it by doing some validation, just in case I don't type it the way you expect. So what you've done is supplied a customized message, error, no Chevys, because that's the way I typed it, but you also supply a list of values that are acceptable. So we could use a distinct list to help us do some validation. Those are just 3 of the things we'll look at. There are other scenarios. In fact, there are 10 scenarios we will look at. But complementary to this session, we have some links. Support.sas.com, training, get started. You can go there and see some of the free e-learning like Programming 1 and other courses that we offer free, Statistics 1 and so on. We have online documentation, which is outstanding. You can look up the statistical procedures, functions, more on SQL, more in the macro language, and many more topics. We also are listing 2 courses that complement this session, the SAS SQL 1 Essentials course, and you can get to this link and search by city where the course is offered. As well, the Macro Language 1, you can search by city to see where the course is offered. SQL, we cover the full range of topics, doing selects, creating columns, doing joins, summaries, and then the macro language, creating macro programs that generate code based on data, based on conditions. We show the power of both. All right, so this is the end of the slide presentation. We are about to go in SAS Studio and look at the 10 scenarios that I mentioned. So we have 1 through 10 scenarios. The first 3 will illustrate what I did showed you on the slides. But before I do that, I would like to show you 2 of the data sets we will use in this session. And you have access to these data sets in the SAS Help Library. If you go to the SAS Help Library, you will see cars, which is one of the tables. And it has like the car make, like Acura, Audi, the model, type, origin, drivetrain. You'll see things like the MSRP, which we will investigate, the invoice amount, engine size, and so on. That's one of the tables. A second table has to do with fish species. So if I go to fish, you will see species. You will also see weight, length, and things associated with these species. So those are the 2 tables that we will use for the most part in this session. So let's get started. I want to go with the first scenario. I'm going to my files and folders, and I'm going to start with scenario 1, which is that listing report. By default, PROC SQL generates a report. If you've never used PROC SQL before, it's a great data management tool. complementary to the data step. It does a lot of features. Let's go through some of these aspects of this particular step. I start with PROC SQL, and then there are some options I can put up here to show like the row number. I can control how many observations get written out, read in. And then there's a title statement. I can have up to 10 titles. On the select, you can choose everything with an asterisk or list the columns you want. So you may not want to look at all the columns. You want to pick the ones that you want to look at. Just type them on the select. You don't put a comma after the last column. You can also create columns with PROC SQL. The from is indicating where the data is coming from. From, and you put the dataset name. A where is optional. If you want to filter, go for it. In order by is optional. If you want to sort, go for it. You can list more than one variable separated with a comma. The default is ascending. You can make it descending if you'd like. And then there's a quit instead of a run. Now I'm going to right click. There's a feature that's available in SAS Studio and in the Enterprise Guide. You have the ability to right click and format your code. I'm just trying to make it a little bit more readable so it's not shifted to the left. I'm going to do a little bit more customization here, move some things around, and have each part of the clause so you can see it. My select, from, where, and order by. I'm going to run this, and here's that listing. The title, Chevrolet, okay, and you see the model, the type, and MSRP. Just to show you something I mentioned earlier, I could type an asterisk. That means select everything, and we run this, and here we go. You see all the columns that I showed you when I gave you a view of the table in the beginning. I want to take you to scenario 2. Here's scenario 2, and there are 10 of these that we will walk through. I actually have a macro program definition. And I haven't even shown you how to create a macro variable yet, but I'm about to. One way to create a macro variable is as a parameter. But let me go to the outside first. I have an options mcompilenote, macro compile note equals no autocall. So that if I have the autocall, if I have an autocall macro program, then I'm saying don't give me notes about it. And that's no big deal because I'm really interested mostly in seeing if this macro compiles successfully or not. So I have %macro, give it a legitimate name, and then the parentheses are optional if I have a parameter. Now this is called a positional parameter. There's also a keyword parameter where you can set a default value with an equal sign. And you could put a comma and put another like Atlanta. If you wanted to create a second parameter, most of the time when you create a parameter, it will be used as a macro variable. Notice when you type it, no ampersand, but when you use it in your code, you put an ampersand. All right, I'm going to right click this again, format it, try to make it a little bit more readable as opposed to having it all left aligned. All right, that's optional, will still work, but I'm looking to improve readability in case somebody inherit my macro program. So here's the beginning, %macro, car finders to name. I have one positional parameter. Then I have my PROC SQL step to get started, an optional title statement, my select to choose which columns I want, from to indicate the table, the where to filter if I want, order by to do a sort. Instead of putting a column name, I can also type what position column I want. This is the first, second, so that one refers to model as well. Then a quit, and then I do a %min to conclude this macro definition. All this does is define it, and it will be stored in the work library in a catalog called macro. And you can save it permanently. This one will be temporary, but once I create it, I can use it as much as I want. I can call it for Chevrolet, I can call it for BMW. So I'm going to run this first with this option called mcompilenote equals no autocall. And this option in conjunction with this macro definition indicates if it was completed, if it was compiled without any errors, so no syntax errors. The next step is to call it Now I'm asking it to execute. When this executes, it will create what's called a local macro variable called car, and I will assign a value of Chevrolet. So Chevrolet will be filtered resolved here and here, and then it will execute the PROC SQL. So here we go. And there's the report. There's the title. There are the 3 columns. In the log, notes look okay. Real time, CPU time. Real time would include a waiting period, CPU time, how much time it took to run it. Let's try a different vehicle. Let's try BMW. And I will go ahead and tell you it's not going to work because the value you type is case sensitive. Here we go. You just get a title, no report. Okay. So it didn't find BMW because it's case sensitive. But I can handle that. What I can do is use a function called upcase for the dataset variable. And then I can use a function called percent upcase for the macro variable. So this function will apply to the dataset variable, the one in cars. This upcase will apply to whatever I type for that parameter, which is essentially a macro variable. So now if I recompile this, and I make it a habit to check my log notes, should do that consistently. And this time, when I check for a mixed case BMW, it gives me the report. Now, in reality, the value is in capital letters. But regardless of how I type it now, even with a big M, I've got myself covered. Now, if I wanted to change that value to uppercase that I type, I could. But it still works. I like to go to the third scenario. The third scenario is intended to do 2 selects. You might recall in one of these slides, I showed you a statistic in the second title. So that's where I'm going. From the top, I have the macro definition again, car finder, and it's just going to write over the old macro program I created and replace it. I have an option called noprint. Well, why would I want noprint? If I don't use noprint, I will get a listing report for whatever I ask for on the select. And let's take a look at what I'm asking for. The only thing I'm asking for is a statistic. I want the mean of the MSRP. By the way, I can format it if I want. The dollar format displays it as currency with a dollar sign and commas. Now I need some syntax, a clause called the into clause, in order to create a macro variable dynamically, so to speak. So I have to type it like this, into colon. Take this result and put it into, you put a colon in front of the macro variable name you want to build, the one you want to create. Select what you want, into colon, the name you want. From the table, that's where MSRVP is coming from, filtering for that make. That will create the macro variable. That's all it does. The next select, I do want to report. And by the way, you can have multiple selects between one PROC SQL and quit. Or I could have started a new PROC SQL statement. Right? But I want it within the same. I reset print, so now I will get a report if I have a select. I'm issuing 2 titles. The first we already talked about. That will display the make of the car like Chevrolet. The second title, the goal is to display the resolved value of that macro variable, which should be the mean of MSRP for that car make. Then I'll select the columns, indicate where it's coming from, where and order by for that particular automobile. So good practice. Run this, make sure it compiles first. Notes are looking good. Then go back to my code and we're ready to run this for Chevrolet. And here we go. We have that statistic. I could have put it in my footnote. The nice thing about this, let's say that Chevrolet makes some new models next year and I rerun this, it will recalculate the average MSRP automatically for me. right? So it's all dynamic. It will create it as soon as I run it, get the result. Well, let's try a different car. Let's try one of my dream cars. I know I won't get a Mercedes-Benz, so I'll try for BMW. Notice this time I am typing in capital letters, right? And we should get a different average. And indeed we do. The average MSRP, $43,285. Very good. Let's move on. Scenario number 4. This time I'm outside of a macro program. I just want to illustrate how to generate a list of distinct values. There could be a number of reasons you're trying to use it. Perhaps you want to put it in a footnote for a particular car make, or maybe you're trying to use it to do some validation. I will show you both. No print because I don't want to report. All I want to do is create a macro variable, you see the into clause, called list. Well, let's talk about what we're getting. I want to select a distinct list of car types. And I want that list to be separated with spaces. You can put whatever you want in the quotes here. I put a blank. So I'm going to create a list of distinct types, put that distinct list separated with spaces, with a space for each value, into a macro variable called list. I could have called it X, Y, whatever I want. I just decided to call it list. It comes after the colon from sashelp.cars. Now to show you that list, in the SAS log, I can use what's called a %put statement. The %put is a macro trigger that writes to the SAS log. Now to make this stand out, think about what color the error is in the log. It's red. So I could put an error colon, and it will write the word error out along with this list. And here's the list. Hybrid, SUV. What if I really don't want that word error to be displayed? I just want the color. Absolutely. You can type a hyphen instead of a colon. I don't need to rerun the SQL because that macro variable is indeed out there. And here we go. We have the list of distinct types for that car make. Sports, truck, wagon, and so on. The next step, I want to use this list. In fact, I decided to put that PROC SQL step that generates a list and make it a macro program, build it in a macro program so that I can supply 2 parameters. The variable I want to list from and which data set to retrieve that variable from, where that variable resides. So if you look at this macro called charList or charList, however you want to pronounce it, I'll go with charList. I have 2 parameters. The variable that I want a distinct list of, you see, select distinct, that variable, and the data set name where the value is coming from. You send it from DSN. Again, when you put the parameters, no ampersand. When you use it in the code, you do put ampersands. The other thing that's different is I have keyword parameters. You see the equal signs where you can set default values, but I'm just making those null values. The other thing I'm doing inside of the macro is I'm making that macro variable list a global macro variable. So it will be globally around my entire SAS session. When you start up your SAS session, SAS creates a global table and it sticks automatic macro variables in there. There's some available in there that we haven't used. Plus, any macro variables you create can be placed in a global symbol table if they're not parameters in a macro program, because by default, they will be local and they go away when the macro finishes executing. But the first thing I did in here was to assure that the list macro variable that I'm creating with SQL will be put in the global table so that whenever I run this macro program and I create list, when that macro program finishes, that list will still be around, available to me. All right, so I'm going to run this. Follow some principles. Always check the log. That's the best practice. And the next thing I will do, I'm going to do 3 calls to this charList macro program. The goal is to generate a distinct list of whatever variable, legitimate variable I tell it to generate a list of. The first one I'm going with is a car make from sashelp.cars. All right, so I'm going to do char list, run this. All right, tells you how much time it used, CPU time. And then I want to see the list. You notice I used the %put error hyphen so I can see it in red. This % goes with the list I just generated. Maybe I should have put them all on the same line. But here's the distinct list. Acura, Audi, Chrysler, Rover, Land Rover, Dodge, Mazda, Mercedes-Benz. Okay, one of my dream cars, still a dream car. Porsche, definitely a dream car. Will probably remain a dream car. Anyway, let's try the next one. I'm generating a replacement list. So if I overwrite it, whatever the new list is what is now the new value. I have species from the sashelp.fish table. And then I'm going to do a %put again. I'm not using a color this time. So I'll run this, call this macro program again. And if you look, bream, parkey, perch, pike, roach, smelt, whitefish, that's a distinct list, separated with a space. All right, the last one, I'm using a numeric value called age. So char list var age sashelp.class. I'm going to use a different word. If you think about it, in your log, warnings are typically in green. Again, if you put a hyphen, it uses the color. If you put a colon, it writes the word and shows the color. Okay, so it looks like I missed my %put. Let me try this again. And maybe I missed it in the log. Here we go. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, all in green, separated with a space. Remember, you could choose whatever separator you want. Just put it in quotation marks. So if I rerun this, to compile it first, and then I'll try the one for, let's try the species again. You see, we're separating with an asterisk. Whatever you want, whatever you like. All right, I really want to go back to a space because I'm actually going to call this char list macro from a macro program from a macro program called car finder. So I want to make sure I do separate these with a space for the list that I generate from a data set for a given variable. I'm going to show you how to reference this macro variable, this macro program from another macro program. So I'm going to scenario number 6. And I have a macro program called car finder. Now, before I call it, I will treat them independent. Okay. I have %macro car finder, a positional parameter. So I'm going to give it a particular car, and I want it to generate the mean statistic on the MSRP for that car, put it in that macro variable, mean MSRP, using the into colon clause from sashelp, where the make is equal to whatever make I specify for the car. And remember, I'm doing a no print because I don't want to create a report. I only want to create a macro variable with this first select. Then I would return or reset the print ability so I can reset print back on. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm doing 2 selects in the same PROC SQL step. If I had a second PROC SQL, I wouldn't have to turn the print back on. Here's my first title for the car, the second one for the MSRP, macro variable to resolve that. And I have a footnote. Check it out. I have a footnote for that list of distinct values. So where is that going to come from? Well, if you look further down, notice I'm calling that first. Okay, I'm calling that first on the variable type from sashelp.cars. All right, so anyway, let's go back to this. I have a from, a where, the order by, and quit. And I have a %min. So this is the conclusion of car finder. Let's compile it. Make sure it runs okay. We follow the best practice. Always check your log. Compilation with no errors. Go back to the code. And I'm going to call char list. And I'm going to do a %put and I need to make sure I spell the word warning correct. So I'm going to call this char list to create a distinct list for the car make, with a type of the car make, and I want to show you what that list looks like. Now notice I have two periods. One will actually go away, and I'll get to that momentarily. So let me run this. And I have the distinct list of the types in green. Okay. Now I'm going to call car finder, which generates the macro variable mean MSRP, filters for the car make, turn the reporting ability back on, have these two titles, a footnote with that list. And remember, I put that list in the global symbol table, so it will still be around. So here we go. For Chevrolet, MSRP. If I scroll to the footnote, you can see the vehicle types. And I'm going to change this to a capital BMW. Now, if I was to give this macro program, or you were to give this macro program to someone, then probably a good idea to validate what they type in for the make. And I'll get to that in a moment. So here's BMW, the footnote reflecting the types. Let's go to the next scenario, number 7. So what if someone doesn't type the card the way you expect? So now we are accounting for that. We're actually doing some validation. Remember that list of types? We're going to use that to help validate what someone types for the value of the parameter. So check it out. After I call char list, a car list, and by the way, this time I'm embedding that macro call within a different macro. I have a macro program called car check, one positional parameter, and I'm making use of an option called the MN operator. That stands for macro in operator. So why am I doing that? Well, you see on the %if, which is a macro if statement, I'm checking for the value of a car to see if it's in the list that I generated. So this IN, for it to behave at the macro language level, I have to tell the macro processor, treat it like a macro in operator, not the regular in operator that would go with a where or an if. So in order to not treat it like text or to treat it like an operator at the macro level, I have to turn this option on with the /. So now I can check for the values of the macro variable, not the dataset variable, the macro variable. I can check its value in a list. And by the way, I don't need to put parentheses around this, all right, because the macro variable will be compared to whatever I generate separated by spaces. Each one of those will compare until it finds one or not finds one, find one. So if it's in that list, %then %do, do the following. For every %do block, just like a regular do, you need an n. But at the macro level, we do %n. Notice there's a symbol in front of the if, the then, the do, and the n. Those are macro language statements, not data step if then else. These can only be used, well, these can be used mainly in the macro program. That's what they're generally used for. So if the car is in the list from that macro variable, then I'm going to generate a validation list on the type for that car make. Then I'll call car finder. So this macro called car check is actually potentially calling two other macro programs. One, char list, and the other, car finder. Remember, we get the listing with the name of the car make in the first title and the mean MSRP. And then here's the percent %n. So what if you don't type it the way I want, or maybe you've written this and someone doesn't type it the way you expect? That's why you're providing validation. Here's the percent else, percent do. You write a note to the log in the color red with a colon so you get the word error, no ampersand cars. Now remember before I said I put 2 dots so I keep one, and I should have pointed that out. But here's the deal with putting a dot. Think about the name of this parameter. It's called car, not cars plural. Well, if I don't put the period here, the macro processor will look for a macro variable called cars plural. And there's no such macro variable called cars. And you will get an apparent symbolic reference not resolved for that. You get a warning about that, and potentially, well, in this case, just a warning. Right? So in order to make it look for the correct name, I put a dot after the R, the letter R. And here's how it works. You can put a period next to a macro variable reference. All right? And the way it works is used as the delimiter, so that if you have an issue with some text following the name of the macro variable, you want to avoid the compromise of the name. And the way you do that is put a period. The macro processor will see ampersand car. And here's the other part of this. When the macro variable resolves, that period disappears. It goes away. It goes away. I'll get the make of the car, and there will be an S put after the last letter, like Chevrolets or Audis or Porsches or whatever it is that I specify. So the first period is used as the delimiter. The second period to the right is used like the end of a sentence. Okay. Next, percent put note. I think it's probably blue. Cars include, and get this, I'm helping whoever uses this. I'm going to show them what the list looks like. Remember, the first period is used as a delimiter, and when that macro variable resolves to that long list, that period disappears. So I'll put a second period so it will look like the end of a sentence. And then percent %n with that do block. I'll try for Chevy spelled right, and I'll try for Chevy misspelling. Let's try both. Here's the good one first. And here we go, Chevrolet. And here's the distinct list at the bottom. And now purposely mistype it. So if you give this to someone, you're validating what they supply. You're going to be out on week and vacation, and you want to make sure you account for a mistake. You run this. Oh, error, no Chevys. Note, cars include. Oh, I mistyped it. So all they have to do is go back, spell it the correct way, and you're good. Now you could put some additional validation. Remember the case? I had the issue with the case of the value. So I could check the percent up case here if I wanted to. Very good. All right. Let's look at number 8. Number 8, 9, and 10 are related. I've created a number of macro variables. Let me show you what they look like. I'm going to do a percent put so that I can show you the macro variables in the log. I'm going to use underscore user underscore. There's also percent put underscore automatic underscore to see the ones that SAS creates. You can do underscore all underscore to see both those that SAS created and you created, or you can do percent put space underscore user underscore just to see the ones that you created. So I'm going to put warning and the word warning and a dash. I think maybe with these keywords, I have to just put the keyword. Here we go. Here we go. Yeah, I have to do that with the keyword. So where you see global, these are user-defined macro variables for the most part. Remember the last list we had was for these makes. And there are a number of other macro variables in here. When I run PROC SQL, it automatically creates some SQL macro variables. One is called SQL opt to indicate how many records that were generated. This 38 is equivalent to these 38 different makes of cars if you add them up. Let's see what else is in here. You've got some macro variables created from SAS Studio. The new username is John McCall. That's my logon. And there are other macro variables created in Studio, and server name, localhost, directory, working directory, and so on. Now, some of these are write protected. Some of these you cannot delete. So I'm about to show you a macro program to delete the macro variables that I am able to delete, such as the list and some others. But some of these are write protected. All right, so let's give it a shot. Here's the first one called delete all. And it's not a bad idea to clean up these macro variables if you have a lot of them. If you have a few, no big deal. Maybe they'll be in a global symbol table. When you shut down, that global table is cleared out anyway. But let's say I'm trying to be, cognizant and just clean things up. And maybe I want this to be a utility macro. Then I run whatever I want, clean things up. I can put it in what's called the auto call macro facility. So I call it whenever I want. It automatically compiles and executes. There's more to that. There's so much more to macro programming that we don't really get heavily into it here. But just think of this as a utility macro where I'm deleting all. I'm just emphasizing in the window environment. Options, no notes, percent local vars. I'm just creating a macro variable called vars locally. Here's the PROC SQL step. And I'm generating a report. I'm selecting the name from dictionary.macros. So what is that about? Let me give you a little background on this. Whenever you use PROC SQL, there are several what we call dictionary tables that you can access. And they track all kinds of metadata in your environment. Think about this. There's a dictionary table called dictionary.tables. It will give you a list of every table in every library in your SAS session. The maps library, the SAS help library, any others that you have active work. There's a dictionary file called dictionary.columns that gives you the name, the type, and other metadata information on every single column, in every single table, in every single library. There are descriptive type files that you can get to with PROC SQL. You can only access them with PROC SQL. But we have some views of those dictionary files in the SAS help library. Anyway, let me just give an example. I'm going to do a select star from dictionary.tables where live name equals, and I'll choose maybe, let's go with SAS help. So I want to get a list of all the tables in the SAS help library. And the star means all the columns. All right, so I can see every SAS table, or really every SAS member type, including tables and catalogs, and then when they were created, how many observations and other metadata information, descriptive information for each data set. Now you're actually looking at labels, so I'm going to type options, no label, so you can see the true column names. Once again, there's several of these out here, so you want to be careful about what you select because you can get tons of information. Here I can see the true name, live name, mem type, creation date, modified date, number of obs, and so on, number of variables. Very useful information. There's one called dictionary.columns, but the one I want to look at is dictionary.macros. Get rid of this where. And I just want to show you what you get from this. You get a list of global macro variables, some that you created, some that PROC SQL created, or SAS Studio created. Here's that list. Remember that list we generated? All these macro, and then you'll see the automatic ones that SAS creates that you cannot delete. So these are write protected. Now some of these values you can change, but they're write protected. There are some global ones. See client and some of these that are write protected. All right. So if I run this macro program, and notice in the log, I'm getting some error message. Out of proper. Remember I said there are some that I can't delete. All right, but I do get a note saying 30 macro variables were deleted. So the ones like list and any others that I define, I can delete. So let's go to scenario number 9, where this time I'm eliminating the ones that I know that I can't delete. So check it out. Select the name of the macro variable, and I should have mentioned this earlier, into a macro variable that I'm creating in this PROC SQL step called vars, separated with a space from dictionary.macros. So that list of macro variables that were user defined will be placed in yet another macro variable that will hold that list of the names of the macro variables separated by space. And I'm excluding where the scope is equal to global, which means user defined for the most part, and the name not like any of these. Because I know I can't delete these, so I'm trying to avoid even trying. And then I'm using a like operator. Whenever you see an underscore, that means any single character. A percent symbol means any number of characters here and here. And I put a / if I want the percent to not be used the way it normally is. I want that slash to be like an escape character. And then what's most important, you see that percent symbol, delete, that will delete one or more macro variables. So whatever vars resolves to, that list of macro variables that I created, and I'm avoiding these, I want those macro variables to be deleted. So I'm going to run this again, well, with the customization. All right, it compiled with no errors, but remember, I already ran this once. And so there's 0 to be deleted because I already deleted them. All right, I'm going to go to my final scenario. It's very similar to what I just showed you, but this is for Studio and Enterprise Guide. I happen to know which macro variables are created automatically, and I want to the ones that are write protected, which means I can't delete them. I'm trying to avoid those. I didn't have to, but I'm doing it anyway. And then I'm going to have the %sim delete to create that list that was supplied to this new macro variable, whose value is the list of the macro variables that I created. Now, just so that you'll see that it works, I'm going to use a %global. Remember that %global statement creates macro variables. I just make something up, X, Y, Z. We're not giving them initial values. They will have no values, but they will exist. And I'm going to put city, maybe state, and season. Just put a few macro variables so I can test this out. So let's run this and check our log. 6 macro variables deleted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 6 that I just created with %global. They're now gone. So this is a very good, folks. This is a very good utility macro called delete all. I can delete the macro variables whenever I want, the ones that I've created. Okay, so there's a place you can put this and just call it whatever you want. There's a lot more to this where we explain the benefits beyond what you've seen, beyond the scope of what we cover in here. But this is a great start for you. Right? So this is pretty much it. As a recap, in this session, we saw some SQL. There's much more to it. You could do joins, you could do set operators, comparing tables, to say what's in table A that's not in B, what's in both, things like that. Union those. You can compute columns, do summaries, create macro variables like we did here. And then in the macro course, we create macro variables, macro programs. I'll show you how to write macro programs that generate code conditionally or repetitively. And they basically use them to write programs for you on your behalf. All right, so thank you for your time. I was looking forward to doing this session for you, And let me just put this back up. My name again is John McCall. Here's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about this session or questions about the course. I'll be more than happy to help you out. My number is 404-754-0530. And listen, you have a great day. I appreciate you taking the time to observe this session. Thank you very much.